Anna Maier from the Learning Policy Institute is here to join us. And Anna and the team at LPI have done a really fantastic report on some of the impacts and outcomes we're seeing from the California Community Schools grant. So we wanted to make sure that you got a chance to interact with this information and get a quick download of some of the impact that they're seeing in California, because it's just astounding. And I think just a real testament to the importance of this work. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Anna to share that information with us.
Thanks, Krista. I'm super stoked to be here. Excuse me. I was looking over the participant list as during the break, and I see some folks who I know well and love working with, and others who I don't and wish I could know everybody's story. But this looks like an amazing group. So, for those of you who are familiar with the LPI research, um, apologies. Hopefully you can learn something new. And I also just encourage any thoughts or questions into the chat as I'm talking. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes about the research we've been doing. And then I wanted to leave some time for Q&A, discussion. Just would love to make this as interactive as possible. So my name's Anna Maier. I'm a senior policy advisor at LPI. I lead our community schools work in California in particular, and I am very excited to share some of the outcomes research that we've been doing. Oh, and I'm based in the Bay Area for those of you from California on the call. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Okay, does that look good? Okay, awesome. Um, so the LPI team, a couple months back, released a report looking at impacts on student outcomes from our state investment in community schools in California. And knowing that not everyone on the call, this is a Western convening, so I know not everyone is Californian. So I wanted to just give a really quick overview of the California Community Schools Partnership Program. At this point, this is the nation's largest community schools initiative, currently serving around 2,500 schools across the state. The investment was $4.1 billion, which was spread over 10 years, and that's going through 2031, 32. The program targets the highest need schools in our state. So on average, 87% of the student body at a CCSPP site was identified as high needs, and I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. And then just a shout out, I see some of our technical assistance providers on the call, but I think what's been really powerful is that local education agencies, aka districts and schools, have had access to really detailed state and regional guidance in the form of a state-approved framework for community schools and amazing technical assistance through a statewide transformational assistance center and then regional technical assistance hubs. And this is run through our county offices of education. But there's also a lot of flexibility in the program, as we know that's the heart of community schools. So I think it's been a powerful combination. And then in the current budget proposal from our governor, we're considering a $1 billion annual investment that would be part of the school funding formula, which is our local control funding formula, or LCFF. So that's very much under debate right now. And moving that from a one-time investment to formula funding would obviously be very substantial. That would also allow for an expansion of the program. So the current proposal is that schools with 65% or higher high needs populations would be covered through this funding. So that would then raise the grant program to probably around 5,000 schools, or about half of the schools in our state. So I think, again, this is up for robust debate at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see where things land. And I will see if I can advance my slide. Okay, so in terms of the study that I'm sharing today, this is building on prior research, and I think this is really powerful because we're starting to see a real converging of the evidence base around community schools. So we can point to multiple robust studies now that are finding similar impacts. Um, Shouting out to the 2017 LPI research review that I worked on, where we were looking at over 140 studies of community schools and their associated features, really trying to start to build that evidence base. I think the work that RAND has done evaluating New York City's community schools initiative has been really, really powerful, very well done. They have their 2020 impact evaluation, but they also have released some follow-up research in the form of journal articles that really continues to show the chronic absence impacts are sustained, and also that the academic outcomes have strengthened over time. So again, what we're seeing is consistent in the evidence base is positive impacts on absenteeism, test scores, where we see strong results, especially for math, looking across some of the different studies, and impacts on discipline rates and school climate measures. I mean, certainly there's other benefits as well, but I think those are some of the strongest trends. Um, and then, what's exciting is that with the expansion of some of the state grant programs, we're also starting to see a converging evidence space. So Towson University has released some research from Maryland, which is really helpful to look at. And so, just continuing to look for those examples of state evaluations. So in terms of the research questions that we were addressing in our study, we wanted to know to what extent did community schools that were supported by the implementation grants improve student outcomes. We wanted to know whether the impacts varied by student groups, and we wanted to know if the impacts varied by school type and school size. And so I'll talk about each of these outcomes. As I mentioned, the grant funding is really focused on targeting the highest need schools in our state. And what we're seeing is that we have both succeeded and actually exceeded the target that we have in the policy. So you can see again, I mentioned just that this is, operating at a huge scale. The funds have so far across 4 cohorts of implementation grantees have reached almost a quarter of California students. And the average unduplicated pupil count, and so in California, that's our index for high needs that includes socioeconomically disadvantaged students, English learners, foster youth. The legislation targeted that funding is prioritized for sites that are 80% or higher UPC. The average across the 4 cohorts was 87%. And you can see cohort 1 was at 89% on average for unduplicated pupil counts. So I think that's exciting because when we see positive outcomes, we see that we're also addressing opportunity and equity gaps for some of the highest need schools in our state. In terms of the analytic strategy for the study, we used a matching design, nearest neighbor propensity score matching. And so basically, we took each of the 458 schools that were in CCSPP cohort 1 and identified a demographically similar school that did not receive the grant. When we say nearest neighbor, we do not mean that they were next door to each other. We mean that they were as close as possible in terms of demographics and trends prior to the start of the grant program. So we then compared the cohort 1 community schools to the matched schools. And we looked at trends and outcomes both before and after the CCSPP schools received the grant funding. So we're really trying to look at changes over time. We focused our main analysis on schools and districts that are newer to community school approaches. In particular, we identified some of the federal full service community school grantees in our state. And we did some analysis of those outcomes on an individual basis because we knew that the timing of the impacts might look different. And I'll actually share a little bit of that analysis that we did for LA Unified, for example. And so the main treatment group was sites that did not have a long history of implementing community schools. The other thing is that we treated 2023, 24 as the first full intervention year. So that's the year where we started to look at outcomes. For cohort one, the first year of the program was technically 2022, 23, but based on when the grants were approved and when the funding actually went out, we knew that a lot of sites were still trying to hire key staff positions into the first half of year one. And so we were interested in looking at, so what are the outcomes after there's been a little more time to implement the grant program? And then in terms of the outcomes, we were using statewide administrative data, specifically around math and ELA test scores, chronic absence rates, and suspensions. And so obviously there's a lot more that matters in terms of outcomes for community schools, but this is what we had access to through public statewide data. Okay, so findings. Just key findings across the study. We found that CCSPP schools reduced chronic absence rates, they reduced suspension rates, they improved test scores. And this is all, in comparison to the very similar schools that did not receive the grants, that they made greater progress in these areas. And to me, what's most exciting is that we saw the largest gains among historically underserved student groups. And I'll dive into the details around that in just a minute. Okay, so what you see here is outcomes around chronic absence and suspension. And as I said, these improved more in the community schools than the comparison schools. So the graph on top for chronic absence, you see that there's a blue line and there's a dotted line, and those are basically tracking each other exactly. That is because we were trying to identify comparison schools that were as close as possible to the community schools before the grant funding was received. And you'll see that we were looking again at 2023, 24. And so what you see here is that the blue line, which is the community schools, that had a steeper decline on chronic absence. So both groups were going down in terms of their chronic absence rates. The community schools had a 30% larger reduction compared to similar schools. And I know that this, it may look like a tiny impact, but it actually was a pretty substantial and significant impact. And then if you look on the bottom for suspensions, again, you can see the two groups of schools were tracking very, very closely. Both of them were going up slightly in terms of suspensions as the pre-trend. And then you can see that community schools had a 15% average reduction in suspension rates. And at the same time that the comparison schools were continuing, that they were starting to slow down on the increase, but they were still going up. Okay. And just to note, I can't actively see the chat right now, so I'm assuming that if there's anything important, Krista, that you'll interrupt me, but I'll look at the chat when I'm done talking. Okay, and again, this is just another way to look at improvements across the measured outcomes. You'll see academic achievements on here as well. So when you think about when the differences between the groups start to emerge, that area in between the outcome lines is what's being measured here. So you can see that on average, community schools reduced chronic absence rates by 1.49 percentage points. The impact on suspensions was a reduction of 0.52%. Academic achievement was measured on a standardized scale, so that's laid out in terms of standard deviations, but you can see that there were positive impacts there as well. Okay. And then in terms of the student subgroups, so when we look at this, we see that the blue lines are just showing the impacts for the overall groups. We can see chronic absence went down, suspensions went down, and math and ELA scores increased in terms of standard deviations. I think one of the things that was pretty remarkable for these early results is that we saw that as a group that Black students benefited even more across all outcome areas from this investment. We also looked at Hispanic students as a group, or Latino, and we saw there that there was a larger than average impact on a chronic absence. Looking at English learners, we saw the largest impact on English language arts test scores. That was larger than the group average. We looked at socioeconomically disadvantaged students, and which, to be fair, was most of the treatment group, but we did find a larger than average impact there as well. Um, and so I think what we're seeing is that again, I think that there's evidence that we're starting to address and close opportunity and equity gaps through this investment. And then the question around standard deviations, like what does it actually mean to say that we gained a certain amount in terms of standard deviations and test scores? Um, we tried to create a grade level equivalent, and this is obviously like a thought exercise, but this is pretty standard in the quant research world. And what we saw is that out of a 180-day school year, that these gains in math and ELA were meaningful, that they were equating to on average 43 additional days of learning for all students in math and 36 in ELA. You can see again that just the size of the impacts were really substantial for Black students in particular, and that we also saw higher than average impacts for English learners, socioeconomically disadvantaged students as well. And then in terms of school type and school size, the graphs here, the one you see on top is looking at chronic absence rates, broken down by school type. And you can see all of them were going down, but some groups had larger increases than others. And then the one on the bottom is looking at student achievement. The brown bar is math, the red bar is ELA or orange. And again, you can see in general that like the impacts were positive, that we were seeing gains, but that the size of the gains was different. And that you can also see that for middle and high schools that there was not a significant impact on math in particular, which was an interesting finding. And so then in general, we just saw that elementary schools had larger impacts on chronic absence and achievement than secondary schools. One thing I will note is that the majority of the sample was elementary schools. We didn't have that many secondary schools in cohort one, so we'll be able to keep looking at that group with larger numbers as we look at additional cohorts. And also that the test scores may not be the best way to measure academic impact as we get into the upper grades. So we've also talked about looking at other measures of around academic impact as well. And then we also saw that small schools had greater improvements than large schools in chronic absence, suspension rates, and achievement. And again, there is probably some interaction effect around the level of the school and the size, but we haven't directly unpacked all of that at this point. And then I also wanted to just note that we also saw that community schools got a bigger boost in test score gains as they improved attendance. And so, like what you see here, the blue line is the community schools, the gray line is the comparison schools. Both groups, if we look at them, improving absence as you move along the x-axis, the gains in gains in regular attendance rates increase. And what you see is then on the y-axis, the test scores. And you can see that the community schools really got a lot of gains as they had students attending more regularly. And there was a positive trend for the comparison schools, but it wasn't as dramatic. And so we don't know, I mean, we can't say exactly why, but I think that it's some evidence that something is happening differently for students when they're actually coming to school at the community schools. Um, and then just a quick look, because I did mention that we did some separate analysis for some of the community school initiatives in California that had been, implementing the strategy for longer. So we looked at LAUSD, we looked specifically at their community schools that are now all part of the state grant program, but many of which started, they have a pretty large cohort that started before the funding. And I think I saw the director of the community schools initiative is on here. So I know there's there's others who are leading this work who are part of the call. But I think it's really exciting to see that you see that there was an increase for math and ELA in Los Angeles Unified that begins earlier, which makes sense based on the timing of the intervention, and then some really, really dramatic differences. And the comparison group here was specifically the high need schools in LA Unified that were not community schools. So we were looking just within the district. But some really awesome gains there. And then I just want to really quickly, I want to make sure we have time for questions. So just note that I think there's a really important place for qualitative research in this discussion as well, because we want to know like how and why we're seeing some of these impacts emerge. One thing our team has been doing is conducting case studies in a couple different locations, which you see on the map here. We wanted to find sites that were part of cohort one. We had two of the sites are cohort one. Linwood Unified is cohort two of the CCSPP implementation. We wanted to get some geographic diversity, including looking at a rural site, which is our site in Kern County, and then looking in general for a commitment to whole child practices. And we conducted case studies there. My colleagues did interviews with district and school leaders, a lot of observations, including site visits, but also attending on Zoom sometimes or in person, professional development sessions, different governance meetings, and a lot of document review, looking at training materials, meeting notes, and just really trying to understand more about what's happening on the ground. One publication that came out of this research was a report on what we saw in terms of reducing chronic absence. So we looked at specific community schools within these places that had really reduced chronic absence dramatically. I think what we saw is not a huge surprise, but I think what was really cool is that we saw a lot of consistency between the conversations we were having in LA County and the conversations we were having in West Kern. And the context could not be more different for those sites, but we just heard real consistency in terms of what people were focusing on. And that included improving family engagement, increasing student connectedness and relationship building. So really hearing that like we want kids to want to come to school, school's a place they want to be, being really smart about tracking and analyzing data. And then, of course, the tiered systems support those community partnerships to really address some of the barriers for students who are chronically absent, leveraging partnerships to support students and families. And we saw that community school coordinators were playing a really important role in making all of that happen. And one of my favorite experiences, I got to drive along with a coordinator in West Kern in her 12-passenger van while she went around and picked up students who had missed the bus because there's no public bus system out there. So we went and rounded kids up. There's also some research coming out now from my colleagues looking at what, district supports for community schools. And there's a brief that I have pictured here. But what we saw in general is that the districts that I mentioned were using funds to offer robust professional learning opportunities. So they were really focused on, creating communities of practice for coordinators and PD for teachers, and just really thinking about like how they could support staff at school sites. That they were focused on strategic partnerships at the systems level as well as to support school sites. They were focused on continuous improvement structures. One example is that West Kern created a county level children's cabinet as part of their work. And so they were bringing together county agencies, CBOs, different districts, and talking about what they could do to increase mental health services and address chronic absence at the school sites. And that they were dedicating administrative capacity. So I think that's really important to say if we want networks of community schools, we need to have that support and that infrastructure at the district level as well as at school sites. And I should say district level in California, but what I really mean is initiative level. And then just a shout out again to our research in LAUSD. The Community Schools Initiative is part of the Division of Instruction, which I think is really important that they really have intentionally framed this work as academic in nature. And some of the professional development they've offered has included a focus on community connected learning, especially project-based learning, and of course, a lot of work around CTE, linked learning pathways. There's a stipend for teacher leadership positions at the community school sites, PBL champions, which I thought was really cool. And then also a lot of PD around restorative practices and social emotional learning. So I think all of this can help us understand, like, why might we be seeing test score gains at the community schools? And in terms of things that we hope to continue researching, we definitely want to look at additional cohorts of implementation grantees. I will also note that the UCLA Center for Community Schooling, which is part of our official state Transformational Assistance Center, is going to be putting out an impact study across 4 cohorts in, I think, late spring, early summer. So it's going to be really great to have that research too. Um, we want to look at student level data analyses as much as we can. We want to look at other outcomes, including teacher retention, A to G rates, which is like our preparation for higher ed, graduation rates. There's a lot else we can look at. And we want to continue partnering to really understand how and why we're seeing these impacts. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Anna, thank you so much for that great overview of all that information. And folks, now we have about probably 5 minutes to ask questions of Anna. So I'd encourage you to raise your hand just so that you kind of get to the top for us, and then we can call on you to ask your question. John, go for it.
Yes, hi. I had put into the chat. It looked like some of those numbers reflected the virtual learning, the stay-at-home order in the pandemic, the changes in improved reading and English language that some of the students were impacted by staying at home and some were not. And so I would like to see in the future some type of normalization curve or graph that takes into account with some dotted lines comparing during the stay-at-home order and how things progressed during that. And especially because LAUSD was the focus. I was deeply involved. I chaired a central committee at the time, and we saw it, and especially in special education. So
Mhm.
I would love to see that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that was one of the challenges is that we actually were missing
Yeah,
testing data for at least a
yeah.
year. Um, but I do think with the comparison strategy, all the schools, well, I mean, there were
Oh, yeah,
differences in return to
yes,
school, but I think that helps us to still say that we can
I
understand
agree. Yeah, don't
facts.
waste time on it, but it would be nice to see. And until last week, I was actually a candidate for school board. So
Oh, well,
it
wonderful.
really makes a big difference to us. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, let's see, Karen or Karen? Not sure how you pronounce your name. I see your
Uh,
hands raised. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karine. I'm wondering if you guys collected any data on Native American students. I know that in the whole country, California has the highest population of Native students. And here at the San Diego County, our Native students have the lowest graduation rate as compared to their peers. So I'm wondering if you guys collected any data on the impact for Native youth and if you were planning to publish any of that data.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So one of the limitations of looking at the school level is that we, like for some of the student, like we've gotten a lot of requests to look at some of the additional like racial and ethnic groups, to look at students with disabilities, to look at foster youth, to look at students experiencing homelessness. I think we hope to look at as many of those groups as possible. If we get into student level data, we start to have a lot more computing power to be able to look at some of groups that may not have the same numbers as some of the groups with a lot more students in them. So I think that's one piece of the puzzle, is to, kind of get to those bigger numbers so that the analysis can extend down to some of the smaller student groups. So yes, I hope that's coming.
In the chat, we have a couple questions too. Um, Keith asked, I would like to know how community connected learning is measured. In our experience, it seems to be the pillar or emphasis that is overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. So I think that's part of why we're saying that we need that research to understand how people are really thinking about teaching, learning, how are teachers involved, how are we supporting them, what PD is needed. Because I don't think it's a direct line. Like, what we can look at is things like test scores, graduation rates. But I don't think that tells us what's happening with implementation. And so to me, that's why it's so important to continue to have, also that qualitative research and input from different leaders in different places and telling us what they're doing.
And there's one from Timothy Hand. Was there any insight to which of the 6 key practices made the most impact with these encouraging outcomes? I can imagine it was a combination. Just curious if anything in implementation stood out.
I'm just laughing because that's what everybody in the legislature has asked us. I mean, I don't think we can quite unpack it that way, but I do think that again, this is where qualitative research is really helpful to understand what people are focusing on. I do think absolutely that there has to be an intentional focus on community connected learning if we really want to see test score gains. I think that the what we've heard really consistently in our case studies is just how much it matters to have the dedicated coordinative capacity at the school sites and at the district level. So it's, not expecting teachers and principals to kind of take on an additional job on top of what they're already doing, but that we're really adding intentional capacity.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Well, we